why is anything worth doing? I find, you know, I'll just say on like on a very personal level, I find the puzzles gripping. I find the issues so deep, and they seem to get, you know, to the very heart of how the world is made. I'd say that especially about metaphysics. And so I find it gripping to engage with these puzzles. Occasionally in engaging with these puzzles, I have these momentary and usually fleeting feelings of like understanding or grasp or like insight into how the world is, and that's kind of amazing. And much more often, I mean, I don't usually have those feelings, but much more often, I find it just rewarding to engage in the profound questions without like much expectation that I'll get to, you know, any deeper understanding, but just the process of engaging with the questions, I find that moving. I feel like, you know, incredibly lucky to have been, you know, able to make a career, have a profession engaging with these, you know, subtle, profound questions. And, you know, for me, like, the value of philosophy is just the wonderment of it and the depth of it. I love being able to engage with it.
Well, so I mean, of course, I actually just enjoy doing philosophy, but you know, that by itself isn't enough to justify, you know, paying philosophers to do it. But I think if we were, I mean, philosophy is some of the most kind of general reflection that we have, and you know, I think, well, just a couple of examples. I mean, one is that philosophy is actually the main intellectual discipline that we have that thinks about questions of right and wrong. You know, I mean, you know, most other disciplines that, you know, that they you know, say, oh, the fact value distinction and we're on the fact side, but and so nobody much else in a way at you know at the intellectual level is thinking about, you know, questions of ethics and morality. I mean, you know, in at least in the kind of general way that they're thought about in philosophy. And you know, I think it's important that we should have some kind of, you know, intellectually disciplined reflection on those matters. I mean, it's not, you know, it's not that we've come to lots of conclusive answers and so on, but, you know, things like, you know, whether some sort of utilitarian, you know, account of the good is correct or not. I mean, those are, you know, those are things which make a practical difference everywhere. So, you know, that's one kind of value philosophy has. I mean, I think another kind, which is, you know, it's kind of on the border between philosophy and mathematics and concerns logic, so it's of interest to me, is that you know, there was a long-standing problem in that kind of area of sort of mathematical logic called the decision problem, and one of the people who solved it was the British logician Alan Turing in the 1930s, and he solved it by basically coming up with the kind of abstract idea of, you know, a universal computing machine, you know, in modern terms, a computer. And then, you know, during the Second World War, as many people know, he actually had one of these machines built, and it was used in, you know, in code breaking and helped to win the Second World War. And you know, and that is what the computer comes from. I mean, it's, you know, it's a slightly more complicated story than that, but you know, that absolutely key episode. It involved the solution to a very abstract problem in mathematical, but also philosophical logic. I mean, you know, Turing had all sorts of philosophical ideas about this as well, and so the kind of very abstract questions which are asked in logic, which, as I say, is kind of, in the overlap between mathematics and philosophy. I mean, they've led to something as practical as the invention of the computer, which has completely transformed our lives. I mean, I don't think that philosophy has to be justified, only by these things, but that's just a kind of couple of examples about the way that this kind of abstract theorizing actually has, very major concrete effects. I mean, just on the case of the moral one, I mean, the whole idea of human rights, but goes back to various philosophers in the 16th, 17th century, people like John Locke and so on. And I mean, the idea of human rights has also, a great practical influence in various ways. So, so as well as the intrinsic value of philosophy, which I think it's just, the kind of understanding we gain of abstract questions is worth having for its own sake. But there are actually also quite practical knock-on effects as well.
So what you may be hinting at or moving toward is the question is ethics, when you do ethics, can that be helpful to the ethical behavior of individuals? Okay, if you're asking, I mean, or are you asking something else? But if that's the question you're asking, I mean, I think some of the best people in the field of ethics are real SOBs. It hasn't helped them to be very nice, but they can have great philosophical insights. But you might say, well, all right. But could someone make use of philosophical approaches to ethics, and a good-hearted person who wants to educate, can they help with ordinary lives? I think they could. I once tried to write a little popularized book about ethics, and my publisher said that I had no talent for that sort of thing. So it didn't work at all. It was sort of embarrassing. So, but I do think yeah, I mean, I think, for example, I mean, I'm a sentimentalist, and now I'm really flying by the seat of my pants. I'm a sentimentalist, and I think empathy is very important. Kantian rationalists don't think empathy is all that important to the moral life. I think empathy is very important to the moral life. And I don't think it necessarily gets you into some kind of human relativity and skepticism, the way many Kantians would say. I think that's wrong. My book, it's called Moral Sentimentalism, attempts to show that sentimentalism needn't make everything relative to human nature or make it all emotional in a bad way. So I do think that you can, and if you emphasize empathy, I think you can speak to ordinary people. You see, we're living in what Franz de Waal calls the age of empathy. The notion of empathy was never breathed about, never bandied about 40 years ago. You're too young to know that. But in fact, 40 years ago, nobody talked about empathy. It was only in the last 40 years. Bill Clinton, I feel your pain kind of stuff. All of that is an impetus toward, and now we think that if a person lacks empathy, that's a major criticism. Well, I think, that a philosopher who puts empathy front and center in theoretical work can speak to this popular culture and this popular notion of the importance of empathy and bring the two together in some way. But I guess I'm not the person to do it. I'm just not the talented one in that area.
Right, but I mean, different people. We have
somebody
different talents, and someone could do that. Yeah.
Somebody should.
Yeah. So
in other words, just to point out that not only are we all talking about empathy here and there and everywhere in our modern culture, but that there's theoretical backing for it. Yes.
So I'm a Quinean, and as a Quinean, I think of philosophy as just very abstract and very general science. And so the answer to that question is whatever values science and the expansion of human understanding that's driven by scientific advance is concerned, that value also accrues to philosophy. Was it Wilfrid Sellers again who said, philosophy is supposed to tell us how broadly speaking things hang together? Well, that's what science is supposed to tell us, and philosophy is addresses those questions that the sciences have yet to find themselves in a position systematically to address, and to make sort of, if not predictions, at any rate, arguments about what strategies the sciences ought to use in addressing those questions. And what, of course, that means is that at the end of inquiry, although we'll never know when we get to the end of inquiry, there won't be any non-scientific questions left unanswered, and so there won't be any distinctively philosophical questions left. But since we're nowhere near that point, and since humanity probably won't last long enough to get anywhere near that point, the enduring value of philosophy remains unimpaired.
So something that I get out of philosophy is the freedom to continuously examine stuff that I take for granted. And I think that's really valuable. Okay, so casting a critical gaze on stuff that that operates in the background, that you take for granted, examining your assumptions and things like that, pressing for deeper explanations of things, or trying to understand how things hang together in an even wider sense than you had considered before. That's all, I think, central to how I think about philosophy, but also really valuable. Why do I think it's valuable? Well, we had some discussion about politics earlier, and I think that it has some application there. We've also been talking about, life planning and things like that, and I think it has application there. It has application even in more narrow contexts. I often talk to my students about how important it's going to be as they move out of their formal schooling and move into whatever sorts of careers they have. Like, if you're just like a robot doing the boss's bidding, first of all, it's not very fun for you, but it's actually like really not good for the organization you work for. Okay, like it might be good for that particular boss because they don't get any flack, but from the organization's perspective, that's going to lead to like no innovation, right? A lot of like stagnant ideas. Like that's just not what employers often want, right? Like they want people who can think for themselves and question things, assumptions that have been made, and try to like improve on the way things work. So I think that's one value. But then also, like, as you mentioned, we talked a lot about another value that I see, which is that, philosophers are trained to critically examine arguments. And so there are many places where you might think that that doesn't have application, like near-death experiences. Man, like people say they're floating outside their bodies. What does a philosopher have to say about it? Well, turns out, right, like we want to think they had the experience of floating outside their body, right? And on the basis of that experience, they're drawing some inferences about what actually occurred. And that space between the experience and the inference, that's exactly where the philosophical training is valuable as well. And again, I think it's going to have a wide application to many, many different areas of our life. And so that's another place. And I'm just going to like connected to these things, I'd say, one thing that's super valuable about philosophy, and I hear this from my students all the time, they'll say like, man, this was the first class where I was just like able to, like I was given freedom and license to just think about stuff and discuss it. And I think that like, it sounds maybe a little bit funny and impractical, but it's like super important. We're curious creatures. And part of the value of philosophy is it does, as a discipline, kind of give us license to explore a wide range of questions and think about them in a bunch of different ways, right? And, like that satisfies, I think, like a real part of our human character, this like intellectual curiosity. So it's valuable for that as well.
Yeah, that's what a great question. Yeah, the piece I think you're referring to came out in the Philosopher's Magazine called "What Can Philosophy Contribute to the Study of the Mind?" And it was based on actually a debate I had with Steven Pinker some years ago that some students set up who were in the mind, brain, and behavior program. And initially it was like, what can the humanities contribute to the study of the mind, which almost seems like, as if one side's going to say nothing and the other side's going to say a lot. So I was the side that said a lot, but using philosophy as a specific case. But I think what philosophy does, one way to think of what it does is, because we study problems, we show how you can study problems, which means that we can thematize a problem as a problem, which means that we're studying various possible solutions to it. And since the problems we study are so difficult, we're lingering in the moment of inquiry where we generate different possible solutions to a problem. And then we explore for each of those solutions what it has going for it and what maybe some of its pitfalls are surrounding it. And then we do that with, and I think that's a form of knowledge, or at least a form of understanding. A form of understanding. When you understand a problem, you understand what the possible potential solutions to it are, and that helps you understand the problem. And maybe eventually, maybe one sort of finds the real solution to the problem, but but even if you don't, that you can still gain a lot of understanding. So on this sort of very old and kind of a controversial question of whether there can be progress in philosophy, I think that's one way. One thing that progress looks like is understanding problems. And I don't think we should underestimate how important it is to understand problems, because if we live in a world that's dominated by technological expertise, full of people who think they have the answers to things, and they do have the answers to things, what they don't always have is a lot of reflectiveness about which problems need solutions, which questions need answers. And as the pragmatists argued 100 years ago, that's always a value question. Which questions and problems should we devote our resources to trying to solve and answer? Like, which medical endeavor should we put our resources into? So in the pandemic, it became profitable to try to find a vaccine. Of course, like we've had coronaviruses for ages. It wasn't especially profitable to find a vaccine for them, but it could have been very, very helpful to find. It was a value decision to pour a lot of resources into finding drugs that be very expensive and help with like rare diseases, but not put it into finding solutions for things that are much more common. So that's just like one example of how it's a very familiar, relatable example of how you could have a lot of means to provide solutions to things, but philosophy reminds us as a kind of intellectual practice and set of habits of the importance and the possibility of actually studying problems and becoming aware of which questions are being asked in the first place, and finding ways to evaluate them and ways to study problems themselves. So I guess those are sort of two different contributions it makes, through its focus on problems as a subject matter.
Remember, I expressed slightly subjectivist views about value early on. From that kind of perspective, what's valuable is partly driven by what people want to do. And it's a simple fact that people enjoy doing philosophy. We mentioned all the high school people and the people first year undergraduates who read about Mary's Room and get really excited and enjoy it. So one justification is people enjoy doing it. This is like the ice cream justification. Well, what's the utility of ice cream? Well, people enjoy having it. We're partly on this planet to enjoy ourselves. That's why I do philosophy and play tennis. So we shouldn't be ashamed of people doing philosophy because they enjoy it, because their students enjoy it. It's fascinating and captivating subject. So that's part of the answer. Another part of the answer is that people think of philosophers as being sort of inside their philosophy seminar rooms, and that's misleading. An awful lot of the best philosophy is to do with the interaction between what we say in the philosophy seminar room and what we learn from outside. So take the case of change I mentioned earlier. One thing we say in the philosophy seminar room is, here are the various concepts of change you might have, and here are their significance. So for example, if you're a four-dimensionalist about change and a four-dimensionalist about personal identity, then of course the justification of punishment becomes rather, well, it has an effect on the justification of punishment, because when you punish someone, you're punishing a later temporal stage You're not punishing the thing that is a sense in which you're not punishing the thing that did the crime. You're punishing something later, which has a certain causal connection, I think, with the crime. So that's the case. But the point here really is it's the intersection between what we do in the philosophy of and what physics tells us about the world, and what neuroscience tells us about the world, and what consciousness tells us about the world. So I don't think there's any particular embarrassment. And as I utter the word consciousness, it reminds me, one justification is people are fascinated by the nature of consciousness. Plenty of Nobel Prize winners, not in philosophy, there's no Nobel Prize in philosophy, have written books about consciousness because I think it's such a fascinating topic. So we shouldn't be embarrassed that we write about consciousness because it's a topic people find fascinating and engaging. So I'm just a little bit bemused by this hostility towards philosophy. I do admit that sometimes it can be a little bit inward looking. So that's partly why I'm such a fan of metaphysics and science, and why I'm such a fan of it comes out of Peter Singer's work, where Peter interconnects issues in philosophy with pressing problems in the world at large. So I think, how about I stop there? I think I've given you my little paragraph or number of paragraphs on the justification of philosophy. And also in a purely pragmatic sense, we're not very expensive. We don't need huge, expensive laboratories. We're on the whole a cheap subject. And
all right, a lot of the current opposition to vaccines, and especially to vaccine mandates, and in general, a lot of the opposition to any guidance from government these days could be described as libertarian, right? That is, the people who say things like "don't tread on me" or "who are you to tell me what to say?" or "I'm not going to be dictated to by the government," or "I'm not going to give up my." They don't even say this, but they could say, "I'm not going to give up my independent agency to external government mandates." So, but these people are not. These people can be characterized as libertarians, as I just have, or at least libertarian in their instinct. But they are by no means libertarians, because they don't know what libertarianism is. My description of them as libertarian gives them, classifies them according to some traditional philosophical categories. But any suggestion that they came to their point of view because they were, in some philosophical sense, libertarians would be, I think, unwarranted and a stretch. They're just people who don't like other people to tell them what to do, and they're looking for little code phrases that will enable them to continue to do what they want to do. So in this way, again, one could describe their position in terms of philosophy, but their position has not been generated by philosophy. Try that one on.
Right, yeah, I'll have to think about that. I just
thought that one up for better or worse.
Yeah, that definitely seems, the example seems fair.
Another thing is that a lot of people who teach philosophy believe that philosophy clarifies the mind and protects one from making categorical errors and so forth and so on. And at a certain level, the belief is that if you study philosophy and try to carefully understand alternatives for action and what they imply and so forth and so on, you will in some ways have become a better person. Now, I don't know how many philosophers you know, or how many philosophy departments you've been present in. But philosophers are not any better than anyone else. In fact, they tend to be a little viler in my experience. But that may be a prejudice of mine. Studying philosophy does nothing for you except make you adept at the distinctions that make up the discipline of philosophy. That's it. Doesn't do anything else for you. Doesn't make you a kinder, gentler person, a better political operative, etc.
So the benefit to society, I think, is, maybe what I'll have to say about that is kind of anodyne. I mean, so one thing that philosophy does for us is kind of provide a model of dispassionate disagreement and exquisitely careful construction of texts and engagement, textually based intellectual engagement. And I think that, one of the things that I tell my kids in my intro to epistemology class is, how things work, it's like you've been over to comment threads, people just start trolling each other almost immediately. What we do in philosophy is we stand for a way of thinking about reasoning and disputation that kind of allows you to not have to do that frustrating, horrible thing, sort of allows you to not let your passions lead you into acting like a jerk anytime somebody disagrees with you. But instead you can sort of say, okay, cool, let's step back, lay out in detail what the issues are and see if we can collectively make headway, right? And so kind of teaching wise, I see presenting people with the idea that you can confront disputation, confusion, and really murky issues in ways that don't make people have to pick sides and then freak out. That's sort of one of the things that I think is kind of our highest value pedagogically. In terms of production of theories, I had this image that I developed when I was on a big Dr. House watching kick, back in the late 00s, the neonatal intensive care unit of theory. So it's sort of hey, there are all these theories out there that nobody's been paying any attention to, and most of them are going to die, but maybe some of them will live, right? And so it's, well, how do you know, right? Well, you have to treat them with exquisite care and develop them. And maybe some of them will, most of them they're just going to not make it, but a lot of them are going to get, some of them are going to get fledged out into society, and then you get things like, for better or for worse, the computer. And so that's sort of research-wise. I guess another thing is, I think that one thing philosophy can do, but does not, because the kind of analytic tradition was set up to stop it from doing that, is to demarcate the distinction between the human sciences and the natural sciences. So I got this book where I'm arguing that mental discourse is fundamentally different from, discourse about the mental is fundamentally different from discourse about the physical. This kind of goes back to this 19th century way of thinking about things that gave us the structure of the university, where it's there's the human sciences, and those go by interpretation and empathy. There's the natural sciences, and those go by observation, objectivity, and experimentation. Analytic philosophy, like Neurath, Carnap, they didn't like that idea. They thought that, we should just they wanted to take the human sciences and remake them in the model of the natural sciences. I think that's a mistake. And the kind of symptom of this is that the analytic philosophy of mind is in a state of kind of constant chasing its own tail. And sort of what I'm trying to do, one of the kind of major enterprises of this book is trying to develop in ways that are up to the standards that of theory construction that Neurath and Carnap gifted us with amazingly, but that bring back to life these ideas that the kind of late 19th century neo-Kantians from the hermeneutic tradition had developed. What does philosophy give me? What got me into philosophy was this charge that I got from my first meeting of this class, Mind, Matter, and Meaning at Stanford when I was a freshman, taught by Ed Zalta. So Ed was talking about here's the problem of free will. Four premises, each one of them plausible, gets you to a contradiction. I was like, oh my God, the problem of free will is something that always seemed so incredibly nebulous. Look at this, you could take this like nebulous, crazy protean shape of confusion and state exactly what it is and like give this kind of mathematical crystalline structure to the whole enterprise. And I was like, this is so exciting. I want to do this for a living, basically. And that's still how I look at it. I just, love doing the work of philosophy. Like I love kind of finding the mathematics and the mush in a way.
Yeah, I think, well, there are several things to say. One thing is that, I mean, well, I do philosophy, I guess, because I really like it. I've always loved it. Have certain kinds of curiosity about certain questions. You want to have them answered, and that matters to me. So that's my reason for doing it. In terms of the value that it can give to society or why it matters, it can matter as a sort of intellectual training, and it can matter for people who care about these things. Anyone who cares about important issues, can benefit from having some sort of philosophical education. It can shape your view of life and other things just through thinking about basic questions. You get a vision of what human beings are, what their place is in the universe. That can have a bearing on your views about value. Your views about what value is can change things. So it can change the sort of person you are, the way you treat other people, the way you think about all kinds of questions. I mean, just to give one example, the way I think about many political questions, because I have a sort of roughly Humean view about many things, is that a lot of them, there isn't a right answer. They're just people have different preferences, and there's no answer to the question. Real life questions often involve trade-offs between liberty and security, or between economic growth and equality, and different people trade those things off at different rates. Those are facts about their preferences. There's no right answer because, again, this is a Humean point. There are relatively few constraints on what preferences are right. Their preferences are not so, they can't be true or false in the way that beliefs can. So when you get into arguments with people about these things, you don't think you're arguing over something to which there's a right answer. And that can make you tolerant. It means that you can enter into some of these discussions and understand these disputes in a spirit, I think, that can make you more tolerant of others and gives you a different idea of what so-called disagreement about these matters consists in. So that's one way in which I think philosophy, for me in particular, in which philosophy has shaped my view about certain things. In terms of broader value, of course, it encourages a questioning attitude. It discourages, trust of authority, especially epistemic trust of authority. It makes people think for themselves, which I think is the most important thing that education can do. So for all those reasons, I think, a lot of philosophy, philosophy could be taught at an earlier age and could actually be very helpful in that connection. So those say some of the things about why philosophy, I think, is useful and important. And its value for me. I mean, I could say more things in specific about particular detailed doctrines, but as a broad picture, I guess that covers it.
So when I think of the value of this sort of inquiry into consciousness, I think there's a number of different things, but I think one thing that I consider very important, and this is where I get very passionate, is that the nature of you and your consciousness, as well as the origin of you, is going to play into the kind of life you live. So, for example, I make an argument in the book, and it's based on a lot of the considerations about consciousness, the nature of consciousness, that you have an intrinsic value and you have a power to choose. And these things, this intrinsic value and this power to choose, I think can contribute significantly to your own sense of meaningfulness in your life. But I don't want that sense of meaningfulness to sort of be based on wishful thinking or some kind of, hope or something. I would want it to be based on actual perception of reality. And so this is why one of the reasons I care about this topic is because I am convinced that studying consciousness leads to a greater vision of the value of the person, of your value and your powers, the kind of being that you are, the powers that you have. I sort of draw this out at the end. I lead towards sort of this conclusion that sort of you're sort of waiting as a reader to see, okay, where is this all going? How does this journey conclude? But the ultimate sort of take home is that you are extraordinarily valuable unit of reality. I mean, it's like there's all these things in the world and all these things to think about. And one of the most familiar things is yourself. And sometimes we take for granted the things that are familiar. But I take it that consciousness really points to the significance of who you are and your powers in the world. So, that's one of the reasons that I think this is a very valuable topic.
I mean, in far as it's a question about me, I just want understanding. I just want to understand these relations between perception, thought, the world, justification. And some of these things absolutely do have application. They have application in issues about grasp of concepts, they have applications in developmental psychology, they have applications in moral philosophy, legal philosophy. But if you ask me, are those applications the reasons you do it? No. Any more than a pure mathematician is working on his or her problems because they might have applications in relative theory or whatnot. I want understanding, yeah.
I think at least one thing is, a lot of philosophers have said, philosophy sort of frees you. And, I don't want to be too romantic about it, but I do think that to some degree that, we're hit with all sorts of claims about good ways to live and bad ways to live, good ways to think, bad ways to think, what's important, what's not important. And I mean, if you want to live a good life, you really do have to sort of step back and think about whether or not these people are telling you the truth or whether or not they're full of crap. And I think a lot of people, unfortunately, are full of crap. And so I think philosophy is helpful for sort of trying to sift through that. It's not perfect, right? Because we still disagree about it, but I think it's among the best methods that we have when it comes to questions about how you ought to live your life and how you ought to think and order your beliefs. Of course, science helps a lot on these things, but when it comes to questions about how you ought to live, science isn't really going to answer that. And when it comes to abstract questions about how you ought to conduct your believing, your life, your intellectual life, it's not going to have much to say about that. So I think philosophy is sort of the only game in town there when it comes to what I regard as the most important questions that you could ask. So, there's probably a billion other things that explain why philosophy is valuable, but that's the ones that occur to me now.
Well, for me, there are lots of answers there. I think that in general, probably studying philosophy does people good in terms of getting them to be able to reason more sharply and in general, maybe tend to be better and more sympathetic people. Of course, there's no guarantee that studying philosophy will do that, but I suspect it has a tendency to do it. And so if a lot of people do it, then that could benefit society that much more. So that's a utilitarian kind of value. To me, there's great value in acquiring knowledge and acquiring understanding across disciplines and fields, including acquiring knowledge and acquiring understanding regarding the problems that arise in philosophy. And I would say that, there's a form of understanding which is less than the full-blown ideal. I think it's valuable to understand why philosophical problems are as fraught as they are, as hard as they are, as perennially and persistently disputed as they are. So there's value in understanding why philosophical problems are hard problems. And I do think that sometimes, to some extent, we get at least partial resolutions of them. And so then we have that further kind of understanding. I also find the issues just intrinsically fascinating, and I get great personal satisfaction out of thinking about them and working on them. And I'll just add one more thing. It's not that common in our field for people to collaborate. I collaborate a lot, and I always have. And there's a particular value in that for me. the value of collaborative philosophical inquiry is something that I get all the more satisfaction out of. And I also happen to think that the discipline would benefit from more collaborative inquiry. In this respect, it seems to me it's similar to mathematics. I knew a guy back at the University of Memphis, where I used to be, a mathematician, who they had a guy who spent about a month a year there, but he's traveled the world constantly and never had a home. His name was Paul Erdős. He was the most prolific published mathematician in history, and he just traveled around visiting people and working on mathematics with them. And this guy told me that Erdős single-handedly almost changed the whole culture of mathematics. Mathematicians used to work primarily by themselves. And because of the influence of Erdős, they collaborate all the time. It seems to me philosophy is like relevantly similar to math. People can really make progress when they put their heads together. I think there should be more of that.
Well, I mean, like I'll tell you what I tell students in my introduction to philosophy class on the first day, that I think the natural way of thinking of human beings is extremely confused. And most people are not aware of this confusion. It's sort of like how, when you're having a dream and bizarre stuff that makes no sense happens in the dream, and you don't notice that it doesn't make any sense. And there's like some contradiction in the dream, and you don't notice that that's a contradiction, but then when you wake up, you notice all the ways that that thing didn't make any sense. Okay. So like the dreaming is like, ordinary people whenever they think about philosophical matters. And then when you wake up, that's like, after you studied analytic philosophy for, it really takes years of study of analytic philosophy. Then you go back and you notice all the things that people said that didn't make any sense. I think an example of this is a lot of people use the word concept in a way that doesn't make any sense. Like infinity is a concept. Like, what the F does that mean? What? So the concept of infinity is a concept trivially, but infinity itself isn't a concept. And if you're just making the point that there's an abstract concept, which is the concept of infinity, well, then that's true of everything. Like the concept of a dog is a concept. So why do people say infinity is a concept, but they don't say dog is a concept? Anyway, so there's that sort of confusion. There's a lot of confusions that people have about, propositions. Like they apply predicates that can only apply to propositions to things that aren't propositions. Like they call things true or false that aren't propositions, or say something is justified that isn't a proposition. Anyway, okay. So, there's some of the examples of the incoherent nonsense views are, just like mental states that go through your mind that don't express propositions because you're like combining concepts that just like can't be combined. Anyway, and by studying philosophy, you stop doing that as much. And you may not actually find the truth about philosophical issues, but you'll at least have views that are coherent, like that are like, definitely meaningful or something like that, even if they're wrong. So it's like, you can be less wrong than you traditionally should be. And anyway, and why do you care about that? Because like the philosophical issues are important to understand your overall place in the universe. And it's just sort of like, it's cognitively good to at least be able to think clearly about your overall place in the universe and the nature of reality and things like that.
Well, here I come back to like this kind, I'll just say this kind, because, philosophy is so varied, as you certainly know, that I'm not sure of the, I would always be prepared to give the general defense that philosophy just is really helpful in teaching people to be critical thinkers and to make analytic distinctions where there are analytic distinctions necessary. And I always see when I read, because I hang around with people from other disciplines all the time, and I almost always think the only real value that I can add here is helping you make distinctions that you should be making that will be helpful to you in progressing. But with respect to my interest in I started out, being really interested in sort of standard issues in philosophy of mind, the mind-body problem, free will determinism, what makes people tick. And, that has always led me to think, because I'm a naturalist, I've got to watch out what's going on in other disciplines. Early on, it was psychology and neuroscience, and now it's more cultural psychology and anthropology. But I really do think here that my old friend and teacher, Alistair MacIntyre, I love that quote that I use pretty much a lot lately, where MacIntyre says this. He says that we would never accept that you could be a philosopher of physics without knowing about physics. And we would never expect that you could be a philosopher of law without knowing about the law. But he laments that ethics often only requires knowledge of, at most, how trolleys operate, we'll say. He says, but MacIntyre says, right, he says, but we don't expect the students who do ethics to study sociology or psychology or anthropology. And then he says that without this knowledge, we're not aware of the varieties of human possibility, and we're in danger of being imprisoned by our own upbringing. And I think that's the value of doing cross-cultural work.
I know it's a cliche, but I think that all philosophy has value in, especially, in the teaching of philosophy, has value in training people to think critically, to ask questions, to not take things for granted. In legal philosophy, it's partly, one part of it is that when I teach my students, they're law students, these are people who are going to be out there in the world, this is what they're going to do for a living. And legal philosophy helps them make their life a reflective life. Is, what am I doing? What's my place within the legal system? What's the place of law within society, within justice and morality? Think about the value of law and the value of their place within law. But also, it helps them to ask the sort of questions that they're going to need to ask for part of their legal practice. As we're saying, a lot of law is unsettled. A lot of law is encouraging courts and administrators and legislators to change the law. And you change the law in part by having some view of what law should be doing and what it's not doing well enough. And to have, some critical perspective on the role of law in general and individual legal rules and individual areas of law. And hopefully legal philosophy helps to give that. I mean, part of what we do is we teach feminist legal theory, critical race theory, law and economics, law and literature, bring a variety of perspectives and a variety of critical perspectives to the law.
I mean, I think there's two ways to answer this question. Like, the kind of philosophy I do is like obviously super esoteric and not very applied to the real world in any kind of direct way. I think the value just lies in like being part of like an educational system and a research system in which like young people can come to college and just like study all sorts of esoteric stuff. And we've got this broad research program where we're just researching everything. And then we're just a better society for like doing this. And in philosophy in particular is like, it just makes you be a more reflective person. If you study philosophy, you become a certain kind of reflective person. And there's a lot of value in that, just intrinsically. It's like, cool. That's one thing. A second thing is like, just basically the study of philosophy is like a study of thinking. And so you become a better thinker. And so like a better problem solver, you're just like better in the world and in a very pragmatic way if you can think well. So that's two things. And then there's a third thing, which is like maybe sort of like dreaming for the future that like, and maybe it's not pure dreaming because I think like philosophy is actually drifting this way of like more pragmatic things, philosophers being interested in more pragmatic questions that have direct impact on the world, right? So not my kind of philosophy, but I'm like a pluralist. I think like let 1,000 flowers bloom and like I think it's great that we have a system where people can be doing like super esoteric stuff like my book, and some people love it. But I think it's also good if philosophy is also like, let's get our hands dirty and actually like use philosophy to solve some societal problems. And I just think it's like a division of labor, because like someone like me, I'm just way more interested in the super esoteric stuff, but lots of brilliant people are interested in these like real world problems, and philosophy can be used to be like, this is the right way to solve this problem. So like if like somebody's using philosophy to argue that factory farming is wrong, and like that gets combined with activism, and maybe like we can put an end to factory farming, that's a good thing. And philosophy can play a role in making that happen. So there's three things. Like philosophy can be applied to real world problems. It can be used to help people become better thinkers. And it can just be part of this esoteric project of like thinking about esoteric problems in science and philosophy.
One of the questions that gripped me when I was growing up is, how should I lead my life? It seemed like there were lots of opportunities, lots of things I could do. And I wondered how to go about selecting a course in life. And there are various ways to do that. And one is to apply standards of morality, think about what makes for a morally good life and be guided by them. But another standard to apply is what's rational to do. Not quite the same standard as standard of morality, but still normative. And I thought that I could get a better handle on standards of rationality than on standards of morality, that my prospects for discovering appropriate standards of rationality were better. So I focused on them, and it's helped me in life. I think that early on I became convinced of the value of probability as a guide to life. That saying goes back to Bishop Butler, and I made that saying my own. I use probability as a guide to life, and it's been valuable for me that way. A lot of advice about what to do is non-probabilistic, but the advice seems better if you make it probabilistic, if you take probability into account.
Well, I think the value is pretty well understood, that you get to be aware of all the bad views you have. So figuring out what's correct in philosophy, that's very difficult. But boy, we're very good in philosophy at figuring out a lot what's bad in a lot of views. And I think this negative role where you expose flaws is of great value, because there's a lot of crazy things that people can get involved with. And when they're rationally criticized, they at least avoid those. It's hard to develop the positive truths, but that's still okay. That's still okay with the value of philosophy. I mean, medicine is the same way. I mean, it can't really make you that positively healthy. It's just health is just an absence of disease. So medicine is pretty negative, but it's very valuable, in that it gets rid of a lot of defective states. So I think that's kind of that negative story. Philosophy is very powerful in the negative end, and that's enough to make it valuable. I mean, I think it's also just fascinating. You can see I just could go on and on. Not everybody is so fascinated. I understand that, but these are just great issues to think about. When people have the leisure to do it, when people had been wealthy, this is the sort of thing they like to do because it's interesting. They didn't do a lot of the other things that you could do and think about. Anyway, so that's basically the most plausible thing I can say about the value of philosophy. And the safest thing is that it gets rid of a lot of bad things. It shows a lot of defects in views that one is tempted to adopt.
I like being clear-headed. I think the tools and informed reasoning are really very helpful.
to me. Some of the substantive issues I'm sort of less interested in than I used to be, because I think there's a lot of nonsense in philosophy now too. There's a lot of, like, I can defend this position against all comers, whether it's plausible or not. A lot of gamesmanship, that sort of thing. Defending a position, a crazy-ish position, because nobody has, and if you can do it really well, it's very impressive to people. So in some cases, I'm a little disappointed with, because when I came out on, when I first got my job, I would teach metaethics, and I would say, there's this kind of convergence. The forms of anti-realism that are popular now look an awful lot like the forms of realism that are popular now, and maybe there's really not that much to disagree about anymore. And now it looks like that was just, a passing moment, and we disagree about a real lot. We just don't talk to each other as much as we used to. So I have some worries about, I have some conciliationist style worries about how good we are at figuring out the truth in philosophy. But I do like the reasoning method, and I try to defend my view. I try to be as fair-minded as I can about it. I find it really satisfying. I think it's a good way to teach people to think straight, right? And to be careful and think about what their words mean, So I think it's kind of useful also, but partly it's just like you said to me, what's the use of the Mona Lisa? I'd say, I don't know, it's just beautiful. That's enough. And there's that component to it too. It's part of it's an important and valuable cultural asset. We're lucky to be rich enough to be able to have funded some of it for, the last 2,400 years in the West.
Well, I think, first of all, that a democracy depends on argument and the engagement of many citizens in the political arguments. Not necessarily everybody. I don't think everybody has to be interested in politics. I once wrote an article called "Two Cheers for Participatory Democracy." I think there is a right not to participate, but it is important if a lot of people are participating in these arguments, and then there has to be room for those of us who try to reflect on the arguments and organize them and perhaps express them in some coherent, or maybe not entirely systematic, but coherent way. I think it's helpful to do that. And I would like to think that that political leaders or the advisors to political leaders read these arguments in their most coherent form and think about them and learn from them. I write for my contemporaries, and I try to write this was very important when I was editing a left magazine, which you mentioned, called Dissent. We had a very strong commitment to Orwell's principles about politics and the English language. We were writing for our fellow citizens, and we had to write in an accessible way. I try to write political theory, as I said, close to the ground, which means avoiding weird hypotheticals, using historical examples, using contemporary examples, talking directly to what I think are the concerns of the people that I'm writing about. So I was very happy when my book, Just and Unjust Wars, against all my expectations, was adopted as a text at West Point. Adopted as a text by officers, many of whom disagreed quite strongly with what I had written, but thought that the arguments were useful for the cadets to engage with. That's what I hope to be doing.
I'm going to give a sort of an answer that's reflective of my general kind of tendency towards meta-normative theory, which is to say, I mean, firstly, I don't think that all, this is answering the question a bit more substantively in philosophy than you maybe wanted, but I don't think all reasons to do things have to be grounded in value. That's just a general point. So not all reasons to do things are kind of like grounded in like realizing some kind of like positive effect in the world or anything like that. And so I think a lot of my own reasons for doing philosophy, they're not really about trying to achieve some kind of value or bring about some kind of value. You know, I'm moved to be interested in philosophy and to do philosophy by the interestingness of the questions in philosophy. It's like what I would call, to co-opt some language that comes from Chris Howard and that I've drawn on in some other work, they're fit-related reasons rather than value-related reasons. You know, so it's a, you know, something is, there's a fit-related reason to engage in some practice when doing so, when that practice has the features that make that response fitting, and the, you know, when it comes to like being worthy of being thought about, like one of those things might be like just being interesting. Like, so I find, and when I'm doing philosophy, I'm not necessarily thinking about like what value will it have to do this. I'm thinking about like, these questions are so interesting and I want to know the answers to them, you know. So that's what I find is moving me, is not like some consideration about value, but about the questions themselves and their, you know, I just think that engaging in philosophy is just part of being reflective about ourselves and the world and the making sense of the world around us and of ourselves as human beings. And that's a project that I find compelling, and that I think a reflective person should find compelling, independently of whether it achieves some kind of obvious practical value to engage in philosophy. So that's one thing I would say. But then I do think that philosophy has some practical value too. I mean, I think philosophy makes us clearer thinkers. You know, bringing the kind of tools that philosophy trains in us as students or as scholars makes us think clearly about all sorts of other topics that are not philosophy. Makes us better at reasoning. And that's sort of the value that I see in teaching philosophy, is trying to equip my students to think better, to think more critically about the world that they inhabit in, the world that they inhabit, the world that they live in. And so I do think it has some practical value too, but I don't think we should be, in trying to explain why we're drawn to philosophy and why we do philosophy, I don't think we should be restricted to just appealing to considerations of the practical value that it has.
What I think of as the value of philosophy, I think of it as like one of the like intrinsic goods. My decision early in my life to be a philosopher or go into philosophy was really made in a frame of mind where I was trying to think of like, well, what is the best life? And, you know, lots of rich people have complained about how much it sucks being rich, and lots of famous people have complained about how much it sucks being famous. And, you know, we've got a lot of information from other people in other eras. And it seemed to me like a good life would be one in which you could be like free of those concerns and live a life of the mind and exploring big, interesting topics. To me, that is a good. I get so much joy from it. It's not just pleasure, it's joy. And as someone who's also a teacher, I see at least some of my students have that same joy, and it just feels so good to know that I helped them get to that. So the question of like what the value of philosophy is, for me, is like, the answer is it's just intrinsically good. And if you can't see that, well, I don't know what to tell you. It's kind of like, you know, if someone, like, how would you convince someone to learn language? They don't know a language yet. Like, you're trying to argue with this newborn baby, like why they should learn English or German or something, learn a language. I mean, they're not going to understand any argument you could give until they first learn the language. And I think in a lot of ways, philosophy is like that too. If you're not capable of doing it, you're not capable of understanding any argument for why you should do it. You do it, and you feel the joy, and you feel the happiness. But the other question, like, what's the value to society? That's a really tough question. And many of us that are educators are really wrestling with that in a huge way, as, you know, more and more institutions of higher education are dependent on tuition, less and less public or state support for higher education. More and more educators have to like make their case to corporate interests. We have to like put everything in terms of how it's going to help capitalism. How is it going to help you become a cog in the capitalist machine? And maybe a good answer to that question is, don't be a cog in the capitalist machine. Yes, I understand you might need a job, but like, there's more to life than that. But how do you convince someone in the state legislature to put more funding into higher, like, that's not going to be a very convincing argument to them to say like, well, it's intrinsically good, or it's like one of the greatest things in life. It's, you know, that's a really hard sell. I do think that it's true that people that are acquire certain skills we recognize as being part of the philosophical package are in a better position to do things like get into law school. They're in a better position to just be writers or do jobs that involve reading. A lot of philosophical training and skill makes you good at taking on management positions where you might be asked to just solve problems in a general sort of way, to be a troubleshooter across multiple domains, to be able to switch careers more rapidly. More and more, that's a thing. People might switch jobs many, many times during their, you know, pre-retirement stage of their life, and philosophy majors have skills that better position them. But those are very difficult arguments to convince anybody of, and we're in the middle of this huge crisis in higher education, because there's fewer and fewer students going into college from high school, in part because there's fewer people. There was this baby bust in 2008, and because of the recession, people were too bummed out to make babies. And now that cohort is coming out of high school and going into the colleges, and it's just so much smaller than it was, say, 20 years ago. And higher education all over the place is just feeling that crunch. And so there's this mad dash for funding and this big problem of how to justify philosophy to the rest of culture. And I really worry that like the most like the so-called highest levels of philosophy have really like cut themselves off from the masses. This is why I think projects such as yours, or, you know, philosophy podcasting in general, public philosophy, is just so important, because I think the culture needs to be reminded of what is good about philosophy, what's fun about it, what's interesting about it. And I think we've done ourselves a real disservice insofar as like we've presented academic philosophy as the only way of doing philosophy, and that, you know, only if you publish in these journals are you really a good philosopher. It doesn't count unless you're, you know, achieved this level of academic success. I think there's a danger of like we've really hurt ourselves as a community, the broadest sense of philosophers. We really hurt ourselves by like making that be the model of philosophical success. Like I think we need to really think about like what's going to track in the culture. What are people interested in that don't have a plan to get a PhD and become an academic or a professor that are, you know. So I think it's up to philosophical creators to think of ways of just making it cool. And I don't think it's going to be an argument. I think it's going to be like, hey, check this out. You know, why are there certain musical genres or like why are there certain books or movies or whatever that are popular that hit it off? Well, it's not because anyone was convinced of an argument. Like no one said like, look, you have to like the Marvel Cinematic Universe and here's a 12-step proof of what you have to like about it. It was just like it took off. People marketed it in certain ways and showed what was entertaining or attractive about it. And I think that's how philosophers have to think about it. If we care about philosophy surviving, we need to just show that it's cool. We need to show ourselves having fun in a way that is accessible to people that don't have PhDs in it. But that's what I think the value of philosophy is. It's like there's something really joyous about being able to understand things in a way that's big ideas, you know, seeing how it all hangs together. That's joyful. And I don't think there's any way of arguing for that. You just have to show it. You enculturate people into it. But you can't argue for it any more than you could convince a non-language user that they should use language.
The value of doing philosophy doesn't have a single and uniform answer. I think there's a lot of philosophy that is maybe not worth doing. And I think that that there's a lot of philosophy that has been done both by individuals and by communities that produce philosophy. And I think it's important to remember that philosophy isn't just produced by individuals. It's against a background of a bunch of enabling conditions to allow people to do philosophy. And those enabling conditions can vary widely from time and place. But I guess I think the kind of highbrow answer to this question about what's the value of philosophy is, well, it's the discipline that gave us all the rest. So if you think there was any payoff of having economics or sociology or political science or computation theory or physics for that matter, these are all as a matter of the actual history of how these things unfolded. These are things that grew out of people engaged in this enterprise that they call and thought of as philosophy, and that over time, as we began to get convergence around methods and presumptions in an area, and they begin to hook onto the world in a kind of robust enough way, we began to get the emergence of these independent sciences. So I think when somebody asks what's the benefit of virtue of philosophy, I think, well, that gigantic mountain of human intellectual and empirical achievement that depended on having advanced foot soldiers, as it were, trying to reconnoiter the frontiers of reason and knowledge and information and the construction of the world. And yeah, it was going to be really undisciplined and unorganized and full of lots of false theories. But that's the price we have to pay to be in the business of isolating and finding truths in a systematic way. So I think what's the benefit of doing philosophy? It's the first pass foundational effort at expanding the scope of human knowledge and the building of fields and the creation and manufacturing of the academy, which conveniently enough, of course, was the name of Plato's school of philosophy that has carried through to today about how the kind of the collective enterprise of knowledge generating works. So that's the kind of big picture highbrow answer. What's the value of philosophy as a kind of individual personal answer, I think, can vary quite widely. For some people, I remember Richard Wollheim, an undergraduate teacher of mine, once when he was asked this question, his reply was something to the effect of, well, look, there's just some stuff I want to know. And philosophy is my attempt to try to answer these questions that have really kind of bothered me personally. And so I think in some sense, for some folks, it's like that. And I guess I think there is a kind of satisfaction that happens to some of us, as the psychologists would describe, a high need for cognition folks, the satisfaction of trying to work through problems and try to understand things for which we don't have widely agreed upon and reliable methods for figuring out what the truth is. Last thing I'll say is a kind of middle level answer. And this is an answer that I think is not at the level of, collective high scale human knowledge generation, nor at the level of being responsive to individual demands to try to see, understand, and know. But sometimes I think one of the values of philosophy is that it provides a community, and I do mean a community, an opportunity to articulate what its presumptions are. Not because we're necessarily going to get a science out of it, but because it is an effort at sometimes collective self-understanding. And I think that's a really kind of interesting and sometimes distinctive effort of communities that can be very varied, time and place and so on, to try to articulate how they understand the world and how it hangs together and what its relationship to other things can be, even if it's not in some strict sense a knowledge-generating enterprise or a discipline-generating enterprise. I think there can be sometimes some value in seeing how communities have understood the world to hang together, because at the very least, it gives us some sense about the kind of the scope and meaning of what it is to be human and what kinds of things we can think about.
Well, let me preface it by saying what I think is hard and maybe in a way bad about philosophy. I think there's a lot of strong opinions in philosophy by very smart people that are not very well grounded. So I've felt in a way sort of sad that I like to think of philosophy as trying to gain knowledge, but I think a lot of what's out there is very intelligent and clever bullshit. Not intended as bullshit frequently. Sometimes it is. I know philosophers that don't believe what they're maintaining. They don't even believe it. But unlike science, philosophy is not grounded in evidence and standardized methods, and that makes it much harder to do good work and to gain knowledge. All right, so what do I do? Two questions. What do I value about it in my trying to do it, and why do I think it's valuable for lots of people, including people that don't want to be professional philosophers? For me, it's valuable because I think the best philosophy, when one succeeds, one gets a new understanding of something, and often things that are very important to us, very large things like mind or consciousness or representation or knowledge. No other animal does this, and it seems to me that human beings, when they try to understand things, are doing something really quite special and wonderful. And when they succeed in understanding something different, for me, that's a very deep thrill. And when I see it reading other philosophers, when I feel like this philosopher's really got something there and really taught me something deep and new, that's thrilling too. I don't think it happens very often, right? Most philosophy is, doesn't achieve anything correct. Most of it's wrong. Most of it will pass away. and so on. But when it hits, I think there's something really special. It's, it's like the specialness of really loving someone, or being loved by someone in a deep, caring, not using the other person for some advantage kind of way. That's special and deep for me at any rate. So understanding is sort of like that. Why is it valuable for people that are not going to even try to get something new? Well, they can understand something that's new. So sometimes even if you're not a professional or whatever, if you're intelligent and follow it a little, you can get a sense, this is a little different. This is a little above the norm. I think I'm getting some understanding here I didn't have before. So you can participate in this thrilling matter of understanding something important in a new way. But even when one doesn't understand something new, philosophy has something to offer. I think that's why it's a cornerstone for undergraduate education. It teaches a kind of open-mindedness. It doesn't always exhibit the open-mindedness it should, but it brings out how complex the world is, and how, if you're going to be reasonable in this world, you need to be open-minded and realize there are going to be other points of view, and what you thought in the first place may not quite be right. You're not open to correcting your own views. Now, I think that's a really basic value in an educated person. And I think philosophy does teach that in probably as well or better than any other subject. It shows how complex things are. It shows, of course, sciences do that, but also shows how tenuous many of our opinions are and how we have to be ready to change them. Sciences don't show that quite as, usefully as philosophy does. So I guess I'm a real believer in philosophy as a part of a liberal education. But I also think it's not just about learning to debate. It's striving for something really special. It's striving for a kind of understanding that, in a way, is always a little beyond what the sciences give us.
My motive to do philosophy was that I thought it was the most exciting thing there is. But that doesn't actually answer your question, because my motive for doing philosophy was not because I think this is important for the world, but I do think it's important for the world. There's a reason why it's so exciting. It's because it forces us to think more deeply than people usually think. Philosophy is thinking hard about questions and problems, and thinking hard about even what seems superficially to be obvious. So, this is not a new thing to say, but philosophers say this all the time when they're teaching intro courses, that everybody thinks they know what knowledge is until you start asking them, what is knowledge? And then they find out that they really don't have a handle on it. And Socrates taught us how to go about that, how to take something that seems obvious, ask a question about it, and force people to confront their many confusions. And, we live our lives based on beliefs about what's good and what's bad, what's knowledge and what's ignorance, what's truth and what's falsehood, what human beings are, and so on and so forth. We live our lives with assumptions about these things, and yet we may not be very clear about those assumptions, and the assumptions may not even possibly don't even make sense. And so philosophy pushes us to think more deeply and with more humility about our beliefs and particularly our assumptions.
Well, I would say philosophy is valuable because, in fact, everyone who is an adult, mature, healthy, functioning person, in fact, does have a philosophy. And the question is whether your philosophy is going to be thought out and reflective, or whether your philosophy is just going to be adopted from watching television commercials and seeing TikTok videos and whatever. Because in fact, everyone does, I think, have at least implicitly a philosophy. They have a view of life. They have a view about ultimate questions. And so I think there's it's very advantageous to have a philosophy that you've actually thought out. You've actually considered the various views on whatever matters you're talking about. And therefore you have a philosophy that is, properly critical, properly thought out, properly engaged with what other people have thought about these issues, rather than a philosophy that's just uncritically assimilated from, again, popular culture or watching TV, the internet or whatever. So I think philosophy is very, very valuable, and really valuable for everyone who doesn't want to be led around by somebody else's philosophy.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so I think it comes back to your initial question about whether I see philosophy as purely prescriptive or descriptive. So you're probably familiar with certain quietist tradition in philosophy, like they go back to Wittgenstein, right? And you think about John McDowell, who think about, well, the role of philosophy is not to sort of revise or ordinary, it's just to, describe something just right in a way that's familiar, and so someone could see that that's the right view. And I think the quietist tradition sort of downplays the prescriptive element of philosophy. And I'm very much in favor of saying, no, philosophy has a very distinct prescriptive role. So part of the prescriptive role is clarifying a concept, right? So again, using the analogy with the insect, right? I think the scientist who points out, oh, spiders have 8 legs and therefore not insects, that's important value, right? In terms of misunderstanding the relationship between spiders on the one hand and ants and beetles on the other, right? So just as that clarification has important value in our understanding of the biological sphere, I think when philosophers clarify our concept of knowledge and say, well, knowledge entails truth, and so individuals who use knowledge in a way that doesn't entail truth, they're misusing the term. That also, I think, clarifies this conceptual normative sphere, right? So there's that element of getting our concepts clearer, but it's also, I think, a further prescriptive dimension in terms of informing how we go about forming our attitudes, the kinds of attitudes that guide our life. So one of the reasons, as I mentioned, that this topic is important to me is I wrestle with the question about, okay, I had certain beliefs where I didn't feel like I had sufficient evidence to establish this claim as true, but I believed it anyway because of faith, right? And then there's a question of, was that being intellectually honest? Was that being rational? Okay. Now, if you hold to a view of, say, you see belief as somehow akin to intention, right? So one difference between intention and belief that I try to highlight is, in the case where your evidence is perfectly counterbalanced, your reasons for and against, say, going to the bookstore or not going to the bookstore, are perfectly counterbalanced, you're free to just pick, right? I could just flip a coin and decide which one, right? When the reasons are equally good. And that is because I think there's no practical analog to agnosticism. And that's another chapter of my book. But now, when I register that actually in the theoretical sphere, there's this attitude that one is rationally required to take when one's evidence is perfectly counterbalanced, or if one's evidence is inconclusive, then that is a challenge to individuals who say, oh yeah, in a case where my evidence is inconclusive, I can just take this leap of faith, right? I would take the substantive claim and say, actually, no, you're not entitled to take a leap of faith. That's a case where you should just remain agnostic. And so there I'm being overtly prescriptive, right? And I'm inviting, this debate, right? But there's no sort of pretense that I'm merely trying to recreate how we ordinarily approach things. And so, so for me, an important part of why I'm a philosopher, I'm trying to encourage what I perceive as being rationally, how to carry about a rationally lived life. And what that involves is getting clear on these concepts, and by clarifying these concepts and the normative significance of these concepts, it gives us a guide of how we should act. And so that's why I think a major part of value philosophy is telling us how we should act and act rationally.
I won't try to sell it. I like doing it myself. Maybe not for everybody. I won't say it's good for everybody. Maybe not. If you have that kind of mind, it's fun questioning things, questioning things that people tend to accept without thinking, and thinking them through. And if you like doing that, philosophy's one area in which you can do, not the only area, but one area which focuses on doing that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm a super optimist about philosophy. I am always baffled by all of my colleagues who spend their life doing philosophy, and then as philosophers spend a lot of time trash talking philosophy and its various defects and inferiority to the sciences and so on. I think of philosophy as the foundation of all other intellectual inquiry. So I have a very old-fashioned view, I guess. I think no matter what you're thinking about, special sciences, ordinary life, religion, anything, you name it, you're just like 2 or 3 questions away from philosophy. And for the most part, the people who are non-philosophers are making assumptions of a philosophical nature. Their entire thinking, their conceptual frameworks, and their worldviews rest on philosophy. And we philosophers are privileged and lucky to be able to spend our life thinking about the foundations of what everyone else is doing. That, to me, is one of the most exciting ways that you can spend your time. And I feel incredibly lucky being able to have it as a job. I had a professor when I was young. His name was Arne Næss. He was a Norwegian philosopher. He used to describe philosophy as follows. He said, philosophy relates to all other intellectual activity like champagne to root beer. And that's my view. Now, a lot of the pessimists about philosophy have arguments. So they will write books or papers talking about how philosophy is making no progress, how there's irresolvable disputes and so on in philosophy, and that reflects poorly on the discipline. I think exactly the opposite. I think we're making massive progress. We've solved almost all the big problems of philosophy, and we're answering more and more of those questions, asking better questions. So my view is we're making more progress than most of than the scientific disciplines, for example. And the disagreements we have are an asset. I have this picture where collectively we've solved the problems. I like to think of it as we're a group of people who are looking for, let's say, a gold coin. And there might be a few thousand people out there looking. And if one person has found the gold coin, then we've found it. And so all it takes is that one of us, the group of philosophers as a whole, has found the right theory. And if you take all the core questions in metaphysics, philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, moral philosophy, and so on, where we've become incredibly good at covering logical space with possible positions, and people have developed really good arguments for almost all the positions in logical space. And so I think it's reasonable to assume that one of those positions in each of those domains is the right one. And so we have found the answers because one of us have. Now, the weird part is we can't really say and reach consensus on who has found the correct answer. But I think that's a good thing. That just reflects something about the nature of philosophical inquiry, because philosophical inquiry is so much about methodology and about starting points that are absolutely fundamental, that you will find people who have different methodologies and who have different starting points who inevitably will reach different conclusions. And it's going to be incredibly hard to convince them because we don't have, so to speak, evidence-neutral data to appeal to. We're at such a fundamental level that when you encounter people with different fundamental assumptions, it's going to be really hard to convince them. But that's part of the structure of philosophy. So that's the nature of the enterprise. We shouldn't expect something. The only way to achieve consensus in philosophy is to force people, or to just hire people who agree with each other all over the world, make sure that people have the same starting point, which would be horribly coercive. Philosophy is wonderful in its pluralism, and it's part because of that pluralism that we've been able to cover all of logical space. And then there are some lucky ones in there who have found the truth, and by virtue of their finding the truth, we have found the truth about all these difficult questions. It's just that given the kind of open, pluralistic discipline we are, it's going to be very hard to get consensus on who they are. But that doesn't mean we haven't found the answer.
Well, as far as the general question about philosophy, I can just say the thing that everybody knows, which is that, what's done in philosophy departments is a very strange ragbag collection of things that are left after other things that were done were shived off into their own departments, right? And kind of what's left in philosophy is not things that necessarily have a deep connection to each other, but just that never became something else. And therefore, I don't think there's going to be a general answer to what is the value of philosophy. You, again, have to go down to cases. Now, in the case of, in what I like to say I do, because I think it's true, is foundations of physics, largely. And I don't use the word philosophy because it doesn't seem to describe what I'm interested in. I'm interested in, at a fundamental level, what is the physical world? And someone can say, but that sounds like physics. And I would say, yeah, it does, doesn't it? It really ought to be something that physicists are worried about. But oddly enough, or unfortunately for weird historical reasons, you can't get a job in a physics department if your interest is in the foundations of physics. You just can't. Hard to get a job in a math department if your interest is the foundations of mathematics. Maybe not quite so hard, but still. So these kind of foundational questions tend to remain in philosophy departments. I've set up this institute, the John Bell Institute for the Foundations of Physics, and by charter, there are 6 on the board of governors, 2 philosophers, 2 mathematicians, and 2 physicists, because there is a single subject matter, but to do it well, you have to know some physics, and you have to know the mathematics in terms of which the physics is stated, and you have to have a sharp ear for ambiguity and understand various conceptual pitfalls, which you get from a training in philosophy. Why is that valuable? Well, I'm nosy, okay? I mean, it's not valuable because I think I'm going to, be able to make better computer chips out of it. I'm just curious, right? This is going back to the idea that philosophy arises out of thaumas, right? Out of wonder. The world is a peculiar place, and I'm just curious about it, and curious in a way that, for me, the best fit is physics. I mean, you can be curious about it in a way that the best fit is biology or anthropology or economics. And I'm not arguing against those. Just for me, there's a certain kind of interest in things that are foundational or fundamental or at the bottom, in some sense of at the bottom, that I have. And that naturally leads you to physics, which is, I think, why, you know, more specialized philosophers of science have a background in physics than any other science, because it's a natural kind of fit between a philosophical curiosity and the way physics is done. If you have no interest, you know, if you couldn't care less what electrons are, I can't. I have nothing to say, right? I do. Fortunately, they pay me to try and work it out, you know. I don't know what it would be to give a compelling argument that one ought to be interested in such things. I can report that I am and a lot of other people are. And I can report there's a lot of confusion out there that needs to be cleaned up. So there's work for people to do.
I'll give a double answer. One is I definitely think it's interesting and important, but that importance has never been why I did it. I mean, I've worked on all the things I've worked on because they were so much fun, and I consider myself really, really lucky to have found an area to work in that's just full of puzzles that delight me. My brother was a baseball player, and our lives were very different, but we realized we had that in common, that we were able to make a living doing something that we just loved doing. Right? But why are they interesting and valuable? Well, okay, broadest answer is anything that gets us closer to the truth of anything, about anything, is valuable. But that's too broad to be interesting. Linguists are very much motivated by the idea that we're uncovering things about the human capacity for language as a really important part of cognitive science more generally. What is it that makes humans human? What is it that makes babies able to do this miraculous thing that they do in their first couple of years of mastering this system that turns out to be just unimaginably complex? I mean, until you try to write down the grammar of the language that they have, even by age 3, you don't realize what amazing little innate scientists they are to figure out the structure of the language surrounding them. So that just, I mean, when I have to write grant proposals, you know, of course I have to say why things are important and worth somebody paying me money to work on, and that's always a huge part of it, and that requires understanding everything about language, and we've always got to be part of teams, because we've got to always find this division of labor of what is part of our linguistic competence and what is coming from some broader competence that's not just linguistic. So we work on the linguistic part, but we always have to be in communication with people who are working on other parts. Like I can remember back when it seemed really linguistically a kind of linguistically spectacular universal that there was a small set of color terms that could be arranged in a kind of hierarchy such that if a language had anything besides black and white, it would have red. And if it had anything besides black, white, and red, I forget exactly how the others went. It would have either blue or yellow next, and then next would be green. And like, how could this be so universal? Well, turns out that comes from the structure of color vision, right? What's innate is color vision, and the linguistic terms follow what's salient from our color vision. So we had to learn from somewhere else that was not straightforwardly a linguistic universal, at least not in terms of explaining it. So that's why I think linguistics is important. Philosophy, I I mean, I always have thought philosophy is important because philosophers think really deeply about the questions they think about and clarify what those questions are really about. And certainly in semantics, we got a huge amount of insight from what philosophers before us had done. I mean, what my work really was, my path was, my training was with Chomsky in syntax. At my first job at UCLA, David Lewis introduced me to Montague, and I discovered what Montague was doing, and I thought, oh, we need that. Can we find a way to use that? So I had this mission, can I put Chomsky and Montague together? And that was the way I initially defined my task. The syntax we use now isn't necessarily always Chomsky, and there's debates about which syntax is best, but still that was coming from the whole tradition of logic and philosophy of language. And I've mentioned a whole lot of particulars along the way, like the Davidsonian event argument, or things that Reichenbach noticed certain things about aspect first. And so the philosophers might not look at as many examples as the linguists do, but when they look at them, they look deeply and hard, and we have had a huge amount of input from philosophy into formal semantics. The first 10 years were all collaborative, because the philosophers didn't know all the syntactic stuff that the linguists knew, and the linguists didn't know all the logic and the philosophy of language basics that the philosophers knew. So the early years were very collaborative. I felt really lucky that Terry Parsons came to UMass the same year I did, and that our first half dozen or so PhD students, that was the two of us on as the main members of their committees, and it was all very collaborative. And then I think the linguists have by now contributed back into philosophy with insights in what the structure of the language is really like. So philosophers of language who don't keep up with that may go off on wrong tracks. So it's still there's more autonomy, but it's still important to keep in touch. Daniel Altshuler just this week has published a beautiful book called Linguistics Meets Philosophy, in which he got people to write on a whole bunch of topics, and on each topic he has a linguist and a philosopher contributing an article. And he got me to write a historical preface on the interactions of linguists and philosophers through the before and through the early development of formal semantics. And that was fun to go back and look at all that and see through the years, all the ways we've interacted and still do.
I mean, the people doing conscious studies, they have this phenomenal contrast paradigm. To say you can see, yes, appealing to your own phenomenology, you can see that there is a contrast. For instance, you hear something that you don't understand, they give you a sentence. It turns out to be a sentence in a language that you understand, but is disguised in such a way that you don't discern what the words are. And then the mask is somehow progressively eliminated, and in the end you understand the words, and then you understand the meaning immediately. So you can see that there is a phenomenal contrast between. So this is one of considerations that is being used to saying that there is something like a cognitive phenomenology. There is a phenomenology of understanding, not just sensory phenomenology that we all grant that there is the difference between seeing red and seeing green. So it's the same with philosophy. I would say. So there was a time when some of Peacocke's writings, he was saying We don't have, unfortunately, we don't have any theory of vagueness. That was before 1975. So I remember myself thinking about vagueness, reading Frege and so, and phenomenology guy. I bet that my situation is like Kripke's when he wrote this. But then Kit Fine came along in 1975. He published this paper on vagueness using supervaluationist techniques. So you read that. Maybe you are not convinced by that theory in particular. Or in fact, it's much better if you can explore different theories that emphasize that theory has consequences. But you compare your phenomenological state before you consider the puzzle of vagueness before going through these papers and afterwards, and it's clear that there is a gain in understanding that is phenomenologically manifest. Maybe you don't have a theory of vagueness, but you could point out what the problem is, why you cannot say this, because, or at least you cannot say this without saying more because you have this problem. So it could be the same here with. We could say exactly the same. So at least this is, I asked my students, I teach a course for last year undergraduates on these issues. And I asked them these questions about Plato and Aristotle at the beginning, or truth in fiction, or this Maschianism. So compare your state before reading all these people that have written very nice things on this: Walton, Greg Curry, Kripke, Wagen. Compare your understanding situation before and after, and I think there is a clear-cut gain in understanding. So, I mean, I understand that many people don't care about conceptual understanding, getting clear about our concepts. They care more about practical life and real things and action. But some other people do care about, as it were, using words properly. For using words properly, you should have as good a reflective understanding of what these words, in particular these big words like truth, knowledge, meaning, fiction, which concepts they convey. And I think that I think it's clear that philosophy. So they say that there is no progress because we still have all these theories, and maybe we still have the same problems as about fiction that Plato and Aristotle. This same confrontation. You could mention people who are on the side of Plato and people who are on the side of Aristotle nowadays. But this forgets that the real gain is in understanding the issues. And, you definitely, if you are interested, if you are perplexed by vagueness or by the Layard paradox or by the Plato-Aristotle debate about getting knowledge from fiction, then you will definitely get a better understanding of what is at stake after going through these philosophical discussions. This is a different thing about, I mean, I don't want to say anything about the status of, I don't want to say much about the status of the theories themselves. I mean, I can say very briefly. To me, the theories themselves, I mean, they have empirical consequences, but we don't use empirical evidence or empirical methodologies. So although they have empirical consequences, and some empirical consequences dispose or at least put serious problems for some philosophical theories. We just try to provide, as it were, rational reconstructions of what is behind these concepts that we use in these cases. And given that, I think that one should be very skeptical about the real truth of the theories themselves. So my own take about the theories themselves is very fictionalist. I assimilate these things and everything that I have said about to the hermeneutics, to the interpretation of fictions. So you could have a difficult, complicated fiction like Mulholland Drive, or last year in Marienbad, and so you could say the same thing. You get exposed yourself to theories, interpretations of these films, apparently disagreeing theories that provide totally different theories. So, and if they are good, so they at least they point out to the facts. So there are facts about the films or the stories that any good theory should take into consideration, explain, account for. So it's not that anything goes, but in any interesting case, there will be a plurality of theories that make sense in different ways, moving the pieces here and there of the stories. And so I would say the same thing that I have said about the phenomenology of understanding. If you think of your state about how to understand Mulholland Drive before going through these theories, and after, clearly you have won a lot of understanding, but that doesn't mean that you should stick to any of these theories. Even if you stick to one for personal reasons, because that's the one that you like and makes better sense of everything. But it's not clear at all that you could say that is that true theory. It's a good story to tell about that. So that is my line about the theories themselves. But in going, thinking about them and considering, for this reason, it's good to be pluralistic and it's good to be exposed to different stories, to different theories. And it's even better if you could use the history of philosophy. If you can use theories that use very different conceptual resources that you have to do if you go through the history of philosophy, because that would produce this gaining understanding but it would be not very rational in my view to stick your neck for one of them, given the resources that we have. That's my line. There is a lot of understanding to be won by going through philosophical theories, but that doesn't mean that one of them has to be true or sensible to vote for one.
Well, it certainly is. That is, the laws of logic and cause and effect are true whether you believe in them or not, and so they determine your fate. So you may as well grasp them the better to make decisions that will align with your incentives, then, as you put it, that will get what you want. It's also a peculiar question, because in the very act of asking the question, you're presupposing that rationality matters and that you're asking for a rational answer. That is, why, according to standards that you and I and everyone else holds, is rationality important? Well, if you weren't already committed to rationality, why would you even seek reasons, and why would you accept good ones and reject bad ones, as opposed to, say, just having a beauty contest or threatening someone to mouth some words or bribing them? The very act of seeking reasons for anything means that you've already signed on to rationality as the ultimate way of determining which beliefs we ought to hold. So but once you do ask the question, once you do seek a rational answer, as paradoxical as that is, then certainly the fact that rationality is almost by definition what gets you what you want, applied thoroughly and consistently. Also, I add in the chapter, why rationality matters, that it's the application of rationality is behind the great material progress that our species has enjoyed, particularly since the Enlightenment, the fact that we have more than doubled our lifespan, we have decimated the rate of extreme poverty, we've reduced the toll of deaths from disease and famine, maternal mortality and child mortality. None of these happen by themselves. It's not as if the universe has some force that makes us better and better, quite the contrary. There are many things that make us worse and worse. But it's only because our ancestors deployed their rationality to try to make us better off. So they invented things like antisepsis and synthetic fertilizer and sanitation and vigorous hybrid crops and so on. I also argue, a little less obviously, that a lot of great moral movements began with a rational argument that if you go back to the origins of feminism, of democracy, of the elimination of cruel corporal and capital punishments, of slavery, there were thinkers, polemicists, philosophers, sometimes theologians, who advanced an argument that some practice of the day was inconsistent with values that people claimed to hold. And there are reasons to suspect that those arguments got the ball rolling via the viral dissemination of pamphlets and books, discussions in salons and pubs and coffee houses that would then influence elites or the powerful and affect real change, triggered by a good argument in the at the outset.
Well, I guess primarily I think it's lots of fun. And that may sound trivial, but it's a very, I think, profound kind of fun. Coming to understand things. I think there are aesthetic values, if there are any such things as aesthetic values. There are lots of aesthetic values in philosophy and in the kind of theory construction that philosophers, I think, do. Coming to see a new and especially perspicuous way of understanding things that seemed like just a jumble or an incoherent batch of stuff before. That can be fun in the way that listening to music can be fun and fulfilling and so forth. People asking these questions will often ask, this may be true of students who want to major in philosophy because it's so much fun, and they're asking, other people ask, well, what can you do with it? How can you make a living? And that connects with questions about what practical value does it have? And I think it does have a lot of practical value. I think that understanding lots of things in better ways and thinking clearly about them can help. I mean, it helps lawyers, for instance. It helps politicians. It helps people dealing with their own personal lives and so forth. So I think that doing philosophy hones our skills in lots of important ways. But I guess I think also, and I don't think this is trivial, whatever, at all. It's just a profound kind of deep enjoyment or fun in understanding things. And if music and movies and stories and so forth have value, then certainly philosophy has value, have a somewhat the same sort. So I guess that's what I would say mainly.